Thank you, everyone, for joining us. My name's Andrea Coomber. I have the great privilege of being the Chief Executive of the Howard League for Penal Reform, and I'm delighted to invite you to welcome you at this Spotlights event today, talking about what are prisons for, and I'll introduce our speakers in a moment. We have today, as of last Friday, 87,284 people, adult people in our prisons, and another 400 odd children. That's 107 more than last week and 2,000 more than this time last year. The vast majority of those people are adult men. We have about 3,500 women in prison. And today's event is really to talk about what is the purpose of that? What is the purpose of prison? What is achieved through prison? What can be achieved through prison? What can't be achieved through prison? And we'll get on to talking about that with our panel in a second. We're going to talk for about half an hour. Then there'll be an opportunity for members of the audience to ask questions. Please put those questions into the Q&A box, because that's the box we'll be monitoring to ask questions of our panel. If you want to put just general comments in the chat or introduce yourselves or respond to things that are being said, then please feel free to put that into the chat box. We are recording this event and it will ultimately be put up on our YouTube, so do please keep that in mind. I'm really thrilled that we've got two really expert speakers or panelists today. Hinpal Singh Bui is a visiting professor of law at the Centre for Criminology at the University of Oxford and an inspection team leader for His Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons. Hinpal has trained prison staff and monitors across Europe, Asia, Africa, and he recently authored this terrific book, which is called What Are Prisons For? And Katie will put a link into the chat about that. A similar titled book is What's Prison For? Which is Bill Keller's book, who's the other speaker today. Bill was the founding editor of the Marshall Project, which is a not-for-profit organisation focused on news in the US that covers criminal justice. He's been executive editor of the New York Times, won a Pulitzer Prize in 1989 for his reporting on the USSR. And last year, he published a terrific long read for Prospect on English prisons and the comparison between an assessment of our prisons compared to America. So we've got two people who've literally written books on the subject, and I look forward to having a conversation with them now. And maybe if I could start by asking about your interest in prisons. Bill, your book begins quite sadly by talking about your mother-in-law being a victim of crime, which is a strange entry to work on prisons. But I wonder, was that what got you interested, or?
No, not really. She wasn't my mother-in-law yet when she was murdered. My wife's murdered in New York. I'm a latecomer to the subject of criminal justice and prisons. And back in 2014, I was in my, I guess, 30th year at the New York Times. I was writing a column and I got an invitation to breakfast with a guy named Neil Barsky, who was a former journalist turned philanthropist, who had a crazy idea of starting a nonprofit news organization at a time when the business model for journalism is collapsed, and the idea that you would start one from scratch was a little audacious. His idea was it would be objective, fact-based journalism focused on the criminal justice system, courts, police, the law, and prisons. And so over the course of 5 years, we built a staff and did the reporting, and that was where I got my education in criminal justice writ large and prisons in particular. The Marshall Project writes about a lot more than prisons, but prisons are the kind of the one piece of the criminal justice system that hides. They don't welcome visitors or attention, and frankly, a lot of people don't want to pay attention. They don't want to know what goes on behind prisons. But anyway, I don't claim to be an expert. After 5 years of running the Marshall Project, I decided to hand it off to somebody else. I'm still on the board, but not active in the day-to-day work of the Marshall Project. But I felt like I knew enough to write a primer on U.S. prisons, which are shameful.
Yeah. We can maybe get on to your assessment of them versus ours in a second. Himpal, your interest in prison?
Well, if there's one thing I didn't want to do when I first started in my career, it was to work in prisons. I thought the prisons were symbols of things which I didn't want to be identified with. I started off as a probation officer, and anyone who works as a probation officer in England and Wales, as opposed to the States, will know that we were trained and still are to some extent in notions of rehabilitation. So ideas of rehabilitation, redemption, helping people to change, trying to recognize the many reasons why people end up in the thralls of the criminal justice system to start with, and then trying to mitigate the harms of the system on people who are both offenders and victims is the lifeblood of probation. So I thought that prison was probably the one thing I would never want to do, and I did my best to avoid it. But circumstances meant that I had an opportunity to go and work in a big London prison. I got there and thought, wow, this is really fascinating, really interesting stuff. It was painful, it was difficult, but I met people who were, at the extremes of human emotion, and I found that incredibly gripping. So there are people who were, very unhappy, distressed, shocked. There are others who were incredibly optimistic. This sense of what they could do to change the things which had gone wrong in their lives was really inspiring. And I felt that I was caught up in a grim fascination of prisons quite quickly, because it felt like a place where you could have the privilege of speaking to people who were at these human extremes, but also to start to perhaps make a difference. And that was my main goal, make a difference to people's lives through my work. And then of course I got stuck in the prison world because maybe stuck is the wrong word actually, but I got further gripped by the prison world because I was completely confused. I didn't really understand everything which is going on around me, and I wanted to stay in that world to build up my knowledge and to try to work my way through this weird world which we've created.
Bill, you know that in this country we have a really strong kind of media, print media, around criminal justice and messages around criminal justice, and often stories about prison are pretty hard to read for those of us who actually know something about prison. I wonder the extent to which as a journalist going to the Marshall Project and getting into that world of prisons, that came as a surprise to you in the US. Like, did you feel like you understood the criminal justice system before you started the Marshall Project, or was that really the point of the Marshall Project?
No, I was 67 when I first went into a prison, so I was a student from the beginning. The thing that struck me and really hooked me on prisons as a subject was twofold. One of them was just the individual contact with prisoners and former prisoners who were not the two-dimensional cartoon characters that you see in the popular press, but were, not universally. They're different, but I met all these accomplished people who seem to be wasting. We seem to be wasting a human resource, I mean, in the US, we let out 600,000 prisoners every year from federal and state prisons. And most of them come out brutalized, without lacking any employment skills. Their family ties have been broken, and their attitudes towards society have become bitter. And we expect them to go out and not return to a life of crime. And that's an unrealistic hope in the system. So that's what really, it was just the sheer waste of it that attracted me to the subject.
Yeah, whenever I feel miserable about our system, I frankly look to the US and feel a little bit happier. That's a terrible thing to say, but I do worry, as you know, that we're kind of sleepwalking our way towards American style mass incarceration. Anyway, I mean, we've got both political parties wanting to build more prison places. But I mean, let's get onto the subject, I guess, of like, you know, what should be prison? What is prison for? Hinval, what do you think is the purpose of prison? What should it be for?
I think a good starting will be reducing crime.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that's the starting point that we have at the moment. You know, I talked about my confusion about prisons, and you know, we hear these very common purposes repeated all the time. You know, rehabilitation, deterrence, incapacitation. Reducing crime is meant to underlie all of those purposes. But one of my surprising discoveries, and you know, I don't know why I'm surprised by this, because the evidence has been building for many years, is that there is a remarkably tenuous link between putting people in prison and reducing crime. And you know, I naively thought that the reduction of harmful behaviors to oneself or to others should be why we have these incredibly expensive institutions. You know, so we put 11.5 million people in prison. At the moment, there are 11.5 million people in prison, and that costs untold billions of dollars. But do we really have an evidential basis of what we're doing? And I would say that if we're reducing crime is our objective, then the evidence is paper thin. Yeah. So we need to go deeper, you know, than those commonly espoused objectives of prison, and try to work out what's really going on. And I think, you know, those things are there. You know, it's not, you know, there are people who go to prison and are rehabilitated. There are people who work in prisons and do an amazing job of helping people to move forwards. But if we're truly to understand the power of the prison, I think we have to go far deeper than that, and to look at things like you know, economic development, nation building, all those things I try and talk about in a bit more detail in the book.
Yeah.
You know, in the 1990s in the US, there was a precipitous decline in the crime rate, and set off a lot of speculation about why it happened. We've sort of tongue-in-cheek wrote a headline, 10 not entirely crazy theories for why the crime rate has gone down. And the reporter who talked to scholars who study this issue came up with some sort of far-fetched explanations, like the legalization of abortion meant there were fewer unwanted children, the taking lead out of paint and fuel cut down on the cognitive damage that those substances do. And then there were more sort of less implausible suggestions, like a sharp increase in the number of police, new technology that made us a little safer from crime, like, you know, ATMs, so you don't have to wander around with large amounts of cash on you, car alarms, home security systems. But everybody that we talked to had to admit that prison, the fact that we were locking up massive numbers of people, had some effect on the crime rate. It's just, as Hinval says, it's a tenuous connection, and one that doesn't really justify the massive number of people who are arrested, or the way we fail them once they're imprisoned.
One of the stories you tell in your book, Bill, is one of the quotes you have is from somebody who talks about whether he was rehabilitated, and he says, "I was habilitated," because it wasn't a question of, and I think that is a lot of to the extent that we rehabilitate people, it's not even a question of rehabilitating people. These are people who often start with nothing, and to the extent that prison might be a helpful intervention, they perhaps should be able to get those interventions somewhere without being in prison, without having to commit a crime, and to get that rehabilitation. And what about punishment? Where does punishment lie, do you think? Because I think that if you talk to a member of the public about what prison's for, I mean, for me, that's the thing we do really well in prison. We're good at punishing people. Our prisons are pretty punishing. But where does punishment sit for you, Bill?
Punishment is a legitimate purpose of prisons. I mean, it's the way that society demonstrates what's considered acceptable behavior, and parents punish their children as an educational method. So the thing is, though, the Scandinavians have a saying that prison is the punishment. It's not the place you go to be punished.
Yeah.
So if you take a prison sentence as that is your punishment, you are going to be deprived of your freedom, not going to be able to live your normal life for some period of time, then we ladle on all these additional auxiliary punishments, if you will, the violence, the wasted time. Prison becomes a place where people are punished. It's not just the punishment by itself. And punishment should be proportional to the crime, and it often is not. We over punish, but I think the statistics say that that's true of both the U.S. and the U.K. That without reducing the crime rate, we have drastically increased the incarceration rate.
Yeah. And Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I think that how we define punishment is important, and how we calibrate punishment against all the other purposes of prisons is also something we need to think about far more deeply. Prisons are riven with contradictions, and punishment may well be a legitimate purpose of prisons, but how does that then fit in with, what I talked about earlier on, reducing crime and rehabilitation? Punishment, as far as I see it, is a way of, quite straightforwardly, it inflicts pain. It's a way of inflicting state-sanctioned harm against an individual. And there are theoretical premises for doing that, and I think there are good arguments that without state punishment, people would take matters into their own hands. But I think we need to be clearer about what we're trying to achieve through it. Punishment at the moment pulls against ideas of rehabilitation, and we need to have a very clear purpose if we're going to have an effective system, because at the moment, I think people working within prisons are a bit confused about what they're meant to be doing. Is it locking up, incapacitating, punishing, rehabilitating, or deterring? I'm not sure if any of us could answer that question. And if people working in and leading prisons can't answer that question, then I think we're in a difficult place. Now, I do think that we have to, so I'm not arguing simplistically for one answer to all of this. What I'm saying is that we need to balance all of these purposes, include punishment in there, but then have a real clear vision of what we're trying to achieve. At the moment, I think prison systems around the world don't really have that vision. And so they trundle along, confused about what they're trying to do. They fall into the obvious uses of prison. So prison is used in different parts of the world as a means of political oppression. It's used as a way of creating a form of labor, to fuel the economy. It's used as a way to create in-groups and out-groups. And these are kind of the lazy purposes that prison starts to take on if we don't have a clear pro-social vision of what it should be.
Bill?
Yeah. Well, to my mind, what prison should be is you have these people in your custody for some period of years, and they're going to leave. As I said, 600,000 a year in the U.S. and I don't know the UK numbers, but massive numbers are set free every year, and you want them to be prepared to return as citizens and neighbors, not a danger. There, Sim-Pol was talking about the places around the world where prison is a form of political oppression or a form of economic exploitation. Those aren't untrue of the U.S. and the U.K., as I'm sure he knows, and he's written about it in his book. Yeah. Michelle Alexander's thesis that mass incarceration was essentially a response to the civil rights movement to keep power in the hands of white Americans. And as far as the economics of prison go, after slavery, there was a huge demand for people to tend the farms in the South, and so they began contracting with prisons to have an unpaid labor force. And to this day, the prisons in both of our countries have spawned an industry of suppliers, managers who profit from the mass incarceration.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that law is the product of power. And whenever I go into a prison and talk to people, they understand that. Like they get that there are a lot of people like them who are in prison and are feeling suppressed and that and racialized and all of that sort of layers of injustice that's in the community, but then prison's kind of the hard edge of that.
You can ask a question. Bill, your book was really impressive in the way that you pulled out positive stories about what people could achieve. And, they're quite inspiring stories about individuals who were working against the odds to do better. And I often have debates with people about the purpose of rehabilitation. And there are, as you probably, I'm sure there are lots of people who argue that prison is fundamentally incompatible with the idea of rehabilitation. What's your thinking on that?
Well, that's true. The prisons as they're configured now are not ideally suited for rehabilitation. The staff aren't trained to do that. The facilities are conducive to it. And then when something comes along like the COVID pandemic, it becomes more convenient to just lock people in their rooms, in their cages, and not let them out for anything. So that's not very conducive to rehabilitation programs or education programs or family, maintaining family contacts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned the Norwegian example, and I've just come back from Norway, and I did a research trip there last year, and I find Norway an incredibly interesting place, and I think we should we shouldn't dismiss the lessons that we can learn from that system. And I think often I talk to people and they say, well, Norway's got lots of money. It's a very much more settled society. It's got huge advantages which we don't have in England and Wales or in the US. I think that's deeply unambitious. I think there's so much going on there which we could learn from. And one of the major lessons, I think, is this crystal clear focus on the idea of rehabilitation. Yeah. So that clearly is the purpose of prison in Norway. And every prison officer I spoke to, every prisoner I spoke to said the same thing. We're not here to be to have any. They didn't express their experience in terms of pain. They expressed their experience in terms of working towards eventual release, and rehabilitation was the goal.
Yeah, Norway, as you say, is a rich welfare state with a more progressive culture. But one of the things I found interesting in your book, since we're going to scratch each other's backs on,
yeah.
on the, is that you've identified a number of places that were doing positive things that don't have Norway's advantages.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I obviously the system I'm most familiar with is our own, and I don't want to talk in too much detail about individual prisons, but there's a report which the Inspector of Prisons published a few months ago on improving behaviour in prisons. And when I read that report put together by some very experienced colleagues, I thought that this was really a report not about improving behaviour in prisons, but about what is a good prison.
Yeah.
And the things identified by that piece of work were immensely obvious. So it wasn't about having wonderful structures and processes. It was about taking time to make human connection. It was about giving responsibility to individuals in the prison environment and encouraging people to support each other. What worries me often about overcrowded, underfunded prison systems is that we subtract humanity and we input process, expecting the latter to compensate for the former, and it doesn't. All it can do is to paper over some of the cracks. So I think this idea of developing a relationship above all else between prisoners, but also between staff and prisoners, is probably at the heart of good prisons. And I think we should all be looking to see how we can do that. And one of my particular passions, by the way, I feel like I should mention this in every event I do, is about food in prisons, because we prisoners routinely complain about the food which is provided by the institution. The best prisons are trying to find ways for prisoners to have the ability to buy food, cook for themselves, and to find the community and connection which food gives to all of us. When I was in Norway, I was struck by the fact that even in the biggest prison I went to, they divided the wings off into small units, and every wing had a kitchen, which is better than my kitchen at home. And prisoners would congregate around there. People were very serious offences, were very difficult behaviours before they came in. And they would talk and collaborate and negotiate and just do that immensely important stuff to rehabilitation, which is about developing a sense of yourself, which is positive, understanding you can communicate with others in a positive way as well, and just feeling good about yourself because you're having good memories of the food which maybe you ate as a kid. So that sort of thing, I think, is what we should be looking at, not all these kind of complicated programs and very complex structures which we can put in place in prisons, but which kind of start to miss the human connection which is needed.
I mean, the letters I receive every day here at the Howard League from people in prison always talk about that loss of sense of self and confidence and loss of connection to family and friends. And I think you're right, food is one way of bringing people together. General Association, it's one of the kind of arguments I've had with the Prison Officers Association when they want to see perhaps less general association, that actually just being in a space with people and playing a game of pool or checkers or looking at books together, these are things, or just chatting, talking nonsense, these are things that make us human. We're only human to the extent that we are engaging with other people, and actually that gives a purpose in a way that purposeful activity may well not necessarily give somebody a purpose, much as I'm all for purposeful activity. We've already got 10 questions, so let's quickly go to the Q&A box and have a look at some of these questions. There's a question, the first question here, Handball, is for you. I'm not sure if you can answer it, given that we're before an election. I think maybe Phil Chaplin to young offenders. I think he has asked a question around educating the electorate on that's fickle on penal policy. Himbo, I'm not sure if you feel comfortable to answer that question.
Sorry, I can't see it. Could you just read it
It's
out?
in the Q&A box. Yeah. In your highly recommended book, you acknowledge the perspective that democracy is too powerful and fickle an influence on penal policy. What can we teach the electorate about the needs of prison reform, and are current political conversations making you more or less hopeful? Yeah, that's a bit of a misquote. Unless I'm misremembering what I said. I think I was arguing that we shouldn't be dismissing democracy as being too fickle an influence, and that we should try to make sure that even if we think we know what is the right way to go, there are people who set themselves up as experts on prison policy. Some people really do know a lot about it. Many, in my experience, don't. And one of the arguments I've heard is that we should somehow find a way around electorates. And, if people are too aggressive in their thinking about prisons, in our view, that we should, quietly find a way around them. And I think I gave an example of how in other countries, expert views are privileged above, democratic accountability and discussion. I don't think that would work in our system here, and I'm not sure if it would work in many other places, and I wouldn't support it. I think we need to have proper, difficult, painful arguments about what prison is meant to be for, and to try to win those arguments. And I think there are some ways into this debate which I think are more sophisticated than simply trying to publicize your point of view and trying to publicize what we think is the best thing to do with the prison system. And one of the things I mentioned in the book is that Ian Loader and colleagues, is a colleague of mine at Oxford, but also has done a lot of work on democracy and crime, argues that maybe one way into this debate is to talk about citizenship in prisons. Make sure that we think about the fact that people are going to come out eventually, and maybe they need to have some say in the democratic process from within prisons. I think it's critical for legitimacy. Really, it would be hard to run however good a prison system without a democratic buy-in, I think. There are a number of observations that have been put into the Q&A, which I have to say I entirely agree with, which is really that we have at the moment a lot of people sitting around doing nothing, locked behind their cell doors. Rehabilitation really is minimal, and we know that is because we have too many people in prison, and that there aren't enough staff, and that in many places courses aren't available, that they're not properly staffed, and it definitely does feel, Simon's put this in his Q&A, that prisons feel like warehouses. I've definitely been to prisons which just have a warehouse feel to them, and then obviously we release people and expect them to be better. I wondered, Bill, if you could talk a bit about the sort of, your book has got a lot of great examples, as Himpo's noted, about different kind of rehabilitation interventions in different prisons. You talk about Sing Sing and San Quentin. I wonder what you think is the sort of best thing you've seen, like the thing that makes the most difference in the US context of all the different initiatives.
I may be a little biased on this subject just because I'm a journalist, but one of the things that I've seen that gives me some small cause for hope is the practice of journalism in prisons. There's an organization called the Prison Journalism Project in the States, which I've been an advisor to, that teaches the the values and skills of mainstream journalism in prisons, and then helps prisoners get their work published in various places. And it's a real boost to the self-esteem of prisoners to be published in a newspaper or on a website. And the skills are that are called for in journalism, some skepticism, respect for data, an attempt to hear out all sides of an issue. There's skills that also have to do, that are useful skills for just living in society. So that's one that I find hopeful about. And as long as I'm touting journalists, I should also own up to the fact that journalism is part of the problem. The Marshall Project was trying to be part of the solution, but the news coverage of crime feeds fear, and fear is what leads to these draconian policies in how we sentence people and how we treat them when they're in prison.
Yes. I mean, there is a couple of questions, people have asked questions around balancing punishment and rehabilitation, which I think Inpal's kind of made clear is a kind of in conflict with one another intrinsically. But an anonymous attendee has asked whether the balance should be the same for all kinds of crimes, sort of assault versus fraud, or, does prison serve the same purpose across a range of offence types, do you think? Or does that make a difference? Should that make a difference?
Well, it does make a difference. Whether it should or not is not for me to judge, but it certainly does. We tend to categorize crimes as violent or non-violent, and then there's a whole subset of sex-related crimes that have a particular opprobrium in both of our societies, and therefore I was going to say disproportionately sentenced, but that's a value judgment. But we do very much punish more severely for cases of sex offenders.
I mean, it's interesting because the only way we know how that's being accorded is through the sentence. Like the actual place they go is all the same. So yeah, I don't know, Hinpal?
The problem is that you could argue that any particular crime that you don't like is deserving of a harsher punishment. And I think that trying to work out which offences should have greater degrees of pain infliction is a fool's errand, actually. I think perhaps it takes us away from the important purpose of, or the important objective of establishing a very clear vision for what prison should be. And I go back to our earlier discussion about making sure that we have an idea of what we want at the end of prison. And if we want to release people who are ready to reintegrate into society, because almost everyone is released at the end, then I think we probably need to shift away from focusing too hard on the punishment side and to think clearly about whether or not rehabilitation is what we are achieving, and whether we're preparing people to go into society and stay out of the trouble which led them to being in prison in the first place.
Okay, there are too many questions for me to keep on top of it now. Somebody asked a question about my trip to the Netherlands. So I was in the Netherlands for 3 days last week at the invitation of Rachel Treweek, the the Bishop of Prisons. And I think my biggest takeaways were that they just have many fewer people in prison. So about like 46, I think, people per 100,000 versus sort of us at 150 people per 100,000. And I can't begin to think how many that would be in US terms. So they incarcerate about a third as many people. And I think that my big takeaway was just that there's a really practical approach to crime, which is you don't want it to happen again. And if somebody's committing an offence, they look to the causes of that offending. And then if that is about drugs or family problems or mental health, then they address the causes of the offending, and they divert a lot of people away at the police station. So prosecutors are at police stations in lots of the big cities and just send people away from the criminal justice system with the support of, victim care, which is their kind of victim support group, lawyers, social workers, probation, all kind of trusting one another. So many fewer people enter the criminal justice gateway, which I think can be only a good thing. Because even in the Netherlands, and we visited, I think, the biggest prison in the Netherlands, and had a look around, and the staff were lovely and very caring, and there was a lot of focus on supporting the men there. And the cells were certainly a lot bigger than cells in this country, and facilities were generally pretty good. But they still have a nearly 50% recidivism rate. One of the other questions in here is about reoffending rates. So even in a Dutch prison, which is a lot better than our prison, where it all just felt much more stable, and the people, a lot of people weren't there, so much smaller population. They still do have really high reoffending rates, which I think is that kind of question Hinpal posed at the beginning, which is, does prison actually stop crime? So, it was definitely it's inspirational in lots of ways visit, and good to just think about different ways of doing things. I mean, they do have 30% of their people in prison are on remand, and obviously, people who haven't been convicted and haven't been sentenced always strikes me as very odd that they be in a prison, because prisons are where we send people to punish them. But I think going back hundreds of years, prisons have also just been places that we hold people while they're being kind of waiting for something else, whether that was execution or transportation or flogging. That's people were held in jails, and we stopped doing all those other three things, but we continue to hold on to the sort of fact of imprisonment. People, you've killed us. There's too many questions. Number of children in prison dramatically decreased in the last decade. Is there any learning from youth justice? I think the learning is don't send people into the criminal justice system. I mean, that is the Dutch thing. Williams asked if you have any evidence, Hinpal, about food and nutrition and rehabilitation. There's an initiative called Food Matters. I'm not sure if you've been in touch with them.
Yes, I have. Yeah. No is the answer. I haven't got any direct evidence of a link between food in prison and rehabilitation. But I think commonsensically, it's very clear to me that having good food makes you feel better. If you feel better, you're more likely to engage in prison regimes. If you engage in prison regimes and are able, assuming there is activity available, then I think you're more likely to come out and stay out of trouble. So I think the theory is very strong. I don't know about the evidence, I have to say.
Yeah. Anonymous attendee at the end has put, how much do you think the public sense of responsibility for preventing reoffending in Norway is responsible for their lower reoffending rates? I mean, I think this is that thing of where my understanding is in Norway, if somebody commits a crime, lots of European countries, it's considered to be a failing of society. We've allowed this person to somehow fall down. They haven't been supported to hold the line and respect the law. Whereas I think here we blame that person, and that's certainly the approach in the US, isn't it, Bill? Where it's not the society or the community that's to blame; it's the bad person.
Bad guy, yeah. We tend to exonerate ourselves too easily.
Yeah. And do you think that kind of personal responsibility, personal finger pointing, and therefore leading to kind of a punishing response, that's a societal sort of imperative? Does that come from American society in a way that doesn't come in Norway, for example?
I don't know. I mean, in the 300 years or so of prisons, the popular view of them has gone through different periods. There are periods when of what I would consider enlightenment, when prisons were seen as ways to redeem somebody, and there have been periods when it was just outright punishment, and it was a crime was an individual sin against the law. I don't think we have a clear shared vision of the answer to that question.
Sorry, go on. I was going to say that I think that, I almost feel like I should whisper this, but I feel like we've got a greater recognition of societal responsibility, which is reflected in the way that prisons are currently being set up. So I think I noticed someone mentioned, I didn't read the question, but I saw the mention of trauma-informed environments in prisons. And that is an implicit recognition that, people are traumatized, and that there's a need to somehow counteract the previous experience of people who end up in prison. And I think there's a lot of focus nowadays on trying to provide some kind of therapeutic environment, with very limited success, I have to say. But there are some prisons which, do better than others at providing some kind of therapeutic regime. And I think that recognizes that the makeup of the prison population isn't accidental, and that we all have something to do with that. The fact that prisons are full of people who come from lower socioeconomic groups, they're full of people with mental health problems, full of people who are in some way socially disadvantaged, means that society has a role to play, not just in the punishment and the containment, but also in the rehabilitation of people once they come out. And I think if you look back over time, this idea of rehabilitative culture, which has become a bit more popular in this country over the last few years, I think is a really important one. It's like a wedge in a door, which can help us to understand why, what a positive prison experience really could be, because it's not just about providing a program or trying to change people's minds through direct cognitive intervention. It's about providing a decent environment, providing therapy, making sure that people are respected in prison, and that things are normalized as much as they possibly can be, which is not very in most prisons, but actually trying to counteract the negative impacts of prison. So all of that, I think, means that we are, even if we haven't gone far enough, we are recognizing that there's a role for all of us to play here.
Yeah, I mean, last year, Bill and I actually visited the G1 wing at Pentonville, which is the autism kind of adjusted wing, and I was recently at Wakefield, and they also have an autism wing, which is just, I mean, not rocket science, and not, if you can do it at Pentonville, frankly, you can do it anywhere. But it did make a difference. Like, it was like the staff approach was different, and they recognized the vulnerabilities of the people in their care better. And I think the staff found the whole process more rewarding, and they got to spend more time. I mean, again, came back to what you were talking about before, Hinpal, about relationships, but they got to spend more time with the men, and they engaged in what would just generally be good practice, like talk to people, don't touch people, like all of these sort of simple things that really should be the way you treat people across the estate. But at least it did put a spotlight on them in that particular prison. I don't know, Bill, what your impressions of that were.
No, I agree with you very much. I was just thinking, one of the things that the UK corrections system has that the United States does not, and which I envy, is the Inspectorate of Prisons. They have complete license to go up, show up unannounced at a prison, talk to anybody they want to, go through the documents, and draw some conclusions about how that prison could be made better. Now, the follow through does not live up to the promise of it, but and the Inspectorate of Prisons has 4 measures that they use to determine whether a prison is what they call a healthy prison. It's safety, respect, rehabilitative work, and a plan for what to do with the individual once he's released. That's not a bad answer to the question of what's prison for.
Yeah. Although it's depressing when you see how prisons rate against that test.
Yeah.
Like it's when and when you talk to governors who'll say, well, at least we didn't get a 1 for X, and you're thinking, well, getting a 2 isn't a win. Like that's pretty dire.
At least somebody's keeping score.
At least somebody's keeping score, and it's an opportunity to shine a light on places that are hidden places, as you said at the beginning. You know, these are places beyond, and so Hinpal and his colleagues get to go in and tell the world about what's happening. And obviously there are limitations. I mean, one of the questions we've had in the Q&A is about the role of the Inspectorate in talking to the public. And I think the Inspectorate can talk to the public about what's happening in prison and what the prison's doing well or not doing well. What the Inspectorate can't do is engage with the policy questions behind that, which is often why you'll see me or colleagues at the Howard League or others in the sector, you know, amplifying messages in Inspectorate reports to kind of put it in a context of this is how prisons are in this position because of X, Y, and Z, which unfortunately the Inspectorate is that's beyond the politics of it, are beyond the HMIP's remit. We're running out of time. I wonder if we've actually worked out what prison's for. Maybe. I mean, I think we all know what we'd want them to be. We want them to be places that restore people to citizenship and return them to the community in a way that means that they don't go back into prison. Is that generally what we want? Mike?
It's what I would
at the moment. Bill?
Yeah. It's what I would want.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, all I was going to say was that I think that maybe there's a prior question which we should address. And when I started writing the book, I thought, you know, I was thinking very much about prison. The further I got into it, I think I was thinking less about prison and more about reducing harm. And I think our starting question should be not how can we make prisons better, but how can we reduce harm in society? And prisons may well be part of the solution. And, you know, people will argue about whether it's a big part or a small part or no part at all, indeed. But I think we're too limited if we just stick to talking about prisons. We have to talk about the wider context.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe in this last few minutes, everybody, if you have a view on what purpose of prison should be, you can throw it into the chat and we can capture it. That would be really handy. I mean, I think I started at the same point. I think I said this at your book launch, Hinpal, that I think that the question is kind of the wrong question. I think we should be starting with, you know, how do we stop people from committing crime, and how do we, you know, capture society's condemnation of those who transgress, and like what are the ways of doing that? And as opposed to saying we've got prison now, how do we give prison a purpose? I think it's kind of the wrong question. The point though is that we have, like, this is a fundamental foundation of our criminal justice system and our penal system. And so I think we do then have this thing of, like, you know, we've got these 88,000 prison places. How do we give them a purpose? How do we make them value, as opposed to saying, you know, is that really the answer at all? My view is it's only a small part of the answer for a small number of people. But yeah. Bill, any other final thoughts?
No, but it's been an interesting and constructive conversation.
It has been. Look at all these people putting questions into the chat, their comments into the chat. Thank you, Andrea Hadley Johnson, and Luke and others. It will be good to be able to capture some of these, and we'll get in touch. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you very much to Hinpal and to Bill joining us bright and early from the US. This format doesn't allow anybody else to clap for you, but I'm going to clap for you. So thank you very much for giving up an hour of your time. Thank you for writing. I'm always full of admiration for people who can write a book, let alone books that are as readable as both of these books are. So if you are in the market for a copy of a book about the purpose of prison, you can take your pick or just buy both of them. And my huge thanks to everybody for joining us. We obviously have an election coming up. As a charity, we need to be careful about what we say in the lead up to an election. There are strict rules around that. But we did send out a message last week with some considerations for you as you approach the election. I think we'll probably do another spotlight event straight after the election to talk about what the incoming government needs to think about with respect to prisons, because July is likely to see another return to all of the prison places being full, and the need for kind of more significant measures in order that the system continue to operate. So it's going to be a really challenging time, I think, in the kind of weeks around the election. So my thanks to Hinpal and to Bill. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get through all of them, for your comments in the chat. And I wish you a really lovely afternoon, and we'll see you again sometime soon. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.